There are certain films that don't just sit quietly on the shelf of cinematic history. They shout, they demand attention, they split audiences, they invite endless conversations. Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, 2016, is one of those rare pieces of work. I want to welcome you, my fellow literature enthusiasts, to this exploration, a journey that isn't really a review in the conventional sense, but more of a literary, theoretical, and emotional dialogue. Before we step into this long corridor of thought, let me kindly remind you to like and subscribe to Cinema Vault if you enjoy peeling back the layers of art. If you enjoy stories told with sincerity and curiosity, it means a lot, not just in terms of growing the space, but because it creates a circle of people who think and feel in ways that are different from the usual rhythm of quick opinions. Here, we take our time, we sink into the words, and we look at film as literature painted in light. When I first encountered this film, I remember walking out of the theater with a strange heaviness. It wasn't the sort of blockbuster euphoria you expect from a superhero epic. It was something far more complicated, closer to what you feel after finishing a dense, sprawling novel whose ending doesn't neatly resolve, but instead echoes questions back into your own life. I could feel in my chest that this was a story that wanted to be read, not just watched. Its images, its pacing, its weight of dialogue, all of it reminded me of the way epic poems or mythologies are told, where gods and mortals wrestle with ideas bigger than themselves. I think that's why it resonates with me even now, almost a decade later. It wasn't about heroes and capes. It was about the unbearable question of what power means, and whether human beings can survive the shadow of gods among them. Now, I know this is a controversial piece of cinema. Some people hated it. Others loved it with almost religious fervor. But isn't that the mark of literature? When a novel divides readers, when a poem leaves half the class baffled and the other half transformed, we don't usually call it failure. We call it art doing its job. This film does that. It unsettles. It breaks rhythm. It refuses to spoon-feed. It paints in grays when the audience might have wanted black and white. And for me, that is exactly why it deserves to be studied, not dismissed. Think of it. On one side, a godlike alien, a figure whose very presence shakes the ground of human existence. On the other side, a man forged in trauma, mortal, yet so determined to fight gods that he turns his body, his mind, and his morality into weapons sharper than steel. Already, even before the first frame, the setup feels biblical. It reads like Milton's Paradise Lost, like the Book of Job retold in spandex and shadows. I remember sitting in the dark, leaning forward, as if waiting for verses to drop from the screen, instead of just dialogue. The story begins with a memory, one that feels etched into the soul of American mythology. A boy, pearls falling, a gunshot in an alley. We have seen it before, but here it is slowed down, almost sacred, a ritual of trauma repeated again as if it were scripture. Then, as the boy is lifted by a swarm of bats, the line between reality and dream blurs. That's how the film opens, with trauma, with myth, with blurred lines. From there, we are dropped into chaos. The skies torn open, buildings falling, humanity staring up at a power they cannot control. The imagery burns itself into you, dust covering faces, fathers shielding children, eyes filled with helpless fury as the city collapses. It's not just action, it's terror and awe. The kind that makes you whisper to yourself, what would I have done if I were there? I think that's what makes this story so powerful. It doesn't let you stay outside of it. You're forced to choose sides. You're forced to ask, if a god walked among us, would you kneel or would you fight? And maybe that's why I find myself returning to it again and again, because it echoes questions I've asked in my own life. Not about superheroes, of course, but about authority, about faith, about the way we look at people who hold more power than we can imagine. Do we trust them blindly? Or do we prepare for the day they betray us? The plot itself moves like a slow burn, simmering with tension rather than sprinting with excitement. You meet a billionaire who has turned paranoia into purpose, who sees every glance toward the sky as a potential threat. You meet a godlike figure who tries to be human, who saves strangers from floods and fires, but carries the crushing silence of not belonging anywhere. And in the shadows, you sense the presence of manipulation, someone unseen weaving the strings tighter, pushing these two figures toward collision. There are moments of grandeur, moments that feel almost operatic. A courtroom fills with ordinary people, their faces twisted with confusion, anger, desperation. A bomb goes off, and silence consumes the screen. The god survives, but the humans are ash. It is one of the most haunting sequences, and it never leaves you. Then there are quieter moments, almost tender. Two figures meet at a gala, exchanging words laced with suspicion and hidden truths. The story teases, again and again, that the clash is inevitable, that the storm is coming, and when it does, nothing will be the same. And then, of course, there's the promise of the fight. The ancient fantasy of gods and mortals colliding, of titans facing off not in Olympus but in our own streets. It is teased and whispered throughout, the looming question, who will win? But what the film does, and what I think is brilliant, is that it makes the fight not just physical but philosophical. It isn't just fists and armor. It's ideology crashing against ideology. It's about fear versus hope, control versus faith, vengeance versus forgiveness. I won't reveal everything here, not yet, but I will say this. The story doesn't play out the way most blockbusters do. There are surprises, devastating ones, that reshape the way you think about the characters, about the very nature of heroism. By the end, you don't walk away with the cheer of victory. You walk away shaken, questioning, heavy with thought. And for me, that is far more lasting. This introduction, this welcome, is meant to set the stage for a journey together. I'm not going to treat this as a film to be judged on popcorn thrills or box office numbers. We're going to explore the way we might explore a dense epic by unpacking its story, its symbols, its characters, its themes, even its production and the oddities that shaped it. Along the way, I'll share what it means to me personally, how it connects to ideas I've wrestled with in my own life, and why I think it deserves to be remembered as more than a superhero clash. So, if you're ready, lean in with me. Think of this as sitting together in a quiet room, a warm drink nearby, and the lights low, as we talk about not just a film, but the questions it leaves behind in the human soul. By the time we reach the end, I hope you'll feel as I do, that this isn't just spectacle. It's literature written in fire, shadow, and silence. The story begins in memory, not in the present. A boy's life shatters in a dark alley. Pearls scatter across cold pavement, and the sound of gunfire lingers in the air like an eternal echo. It is ritual by now, a trauma we have witnessed before, but here it is presented with the solemnity of Scripture. The child falls, not just into grief but into myth, lifted in his dream by a storm of bats into the very symbol that will define him. From that moment, the narrative makes it clear. This tale is not just about heroes but about wounds, and how wounds reshape the way we see gods. The frame shifts, and suddenly, the earth itself trembles. Smoke, fire, collapsing steel, chaos reigns a city under siege. From the streets, the perspective is not one of glory but of terror. People run through dust-filled air. Skyscrapers bend like weakened trees, and somewhere above, titans wage a battle too enormous for mortals to comprehend. The camera does not let us watch the gods fight. It forces us to stand with the humans crushed beneath their shadows. And in that chaos, one man watches, powerless or furious, as lives are swallowed whole by the catastrophe. His jaw clenches, his eyes burn with helpless rage, and in that moment, you understand, this disaster is not just background, it is the birth of a vendetta. The passage of time carries us forward, but that memory lingers like a scar etched into the soul of the city. Whispers begin to rise. Who is this being that descends from the skies? Savior or threat? God or invader? Some look up with gratitude, whispering prayers of thanks for lives saved in floods, fires, and disasters. Others narrow their eyes, wondering how long before this God decides to rule rather than rescue. The world itself seems divided, half kneeling, half preparing for war. Our story threads itself into quieter moments, moments where myth tries to become human. A farmer's family is saved from drowning. The figure in blue lifts them with ease, yet his expression carries the weight of isolation. In another corner of the world, desperate victims are pulled from fire, but instead of celebration, suspicion lingers. Can such a being ever truly belong to humanity, or is he destined always to be apart? These moments reveal the heart of the story, not about battles, but about belonging, mistrust, and the fragile line between hope and fear. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Another figure begins his march. He is not a god, but he is no less dangerous. His body, scarred by years of obsession, is forged into an instrument of vengeance. His nights are spent branding criminals, not just punishing them but marking them, sending a message that fear has returned to the streets. His methods are brutal, his morality blurred. The years have hardened him. He no longer sees shades of gray, only threats that must be eradicated before they grow. He reads the headlines about the alien savior, and all he sees is danger. Every rescue looks like an omen. Every act of godlike strength looks like a prelude to tyranny. The threads tighten when disaster strikes a different stage. A hearing meant to hold a god accountable. People gather in hope of answers. Their faces line confusion and anger. Here, perhaps, humanity can demand explanation, can voice its fear. But the moment turns tragic, unbearably so. An explosion rips through the chamber, silencing voices in an instant. Ash and fire consume everything. The god survives, untouched, standing amidst the ruins, and in that silence the questions sharpen into accusations. Why did he not stop it? Why must mortals die while he walks away unscathed? From that moment, suspicion becomes a firestorm. The man who lost his city to falling towers now sees confirmation of his fears. This god cannot be trusted. This god must be stopped. He begins his preparations in secret, pouring wealth, intelligence, and fury into weapons forged from the very stones of the alien's homeworld. His nightmares grow darker, visions of wastelands, of soldiers bowing to a tyrant, of the future crushed under divine heel. Whether these visions are prophecy, paranoia, or manipulation, they fuel him, convincing him that humanity's survival depends on striking first. But the story does not rest in paranoia alone. Another thread winds its way into the fabric, a puppet master moving quietly, weaving schemes with unsettling patience. He manipulates headlines, fuels suspicions, and sets traps designed to make enemies collide. This figure hides beneath youthful energy, a veneer of brilliance and charisma, but beneath it lies a kind of madness that delights in chaos. He doesn't need to throw punches. He pulls strings, turning gods and men against one another, smiling as the tension escalates toward inevitable collision. And yet, amid the grandeur and chaos, there are human moments, tender and quiet. A reporter wrestles with her love for a god, torn between devotion and the knowledge that his very presence paints a target on the world. A man haunted by his parents' death stares into the mask of his enemy, his eyes filled with the determination of someone who refuses to bow. These intimate moments remind us that beneath the armor and spectacle, the story beats with human conflict, love, fear, resentment, hope. The stage is set not just for a battle of fists, but for a battle of philosophies. The god wishes to prove that his existence can inspire hope, that even with ultimate power he can choose compassion. The mortal, armored and burning with vengeance, is determined to prove that no one, not even a savior, is beyond accountability. And in the shadows, the puppeteer tightens his grip, ensuring that when the clash comes, it will not just be physical, it will be catastrophic. By the time we reach this point, the world feels like it is teetering on the edge. The cities are tense, the skies heavy, the people restless. You can feel it building in your chest, that storm that must break, that collision that cannot be avoided. And as the final scenes of this act draw near, you realize you are not just watching two figures prepare for battle. You are watching the unraveling of trust itself, the slow collapse of any possibility of peace. The storm that had been brewing finally begins to break. The air itself feels heavier, as though the world senses that the delicate balance between hope and fear has tipped towards something irreversible. The mortal, now fully armed with weapons carved from the alien's own world, readies himself not simply for battle, but for judgment. He convinces himself that this isn't vengeance, it is necessity. Yet the rage simmering in his eyes betrays him. Beneath the armor of purpose lies a heart driven by grief, by paranoia, by an almost desperate need to prove that gods can fall. Across the city, the other figure, the god who never asked to be one, finds himself caught in a spiral of doubt. He saves, he intervenes, he risks his life again and again, but all he hears in return are the cries of suspicion. The bombing in the hearing chamber still haunts him. the blood on the floor staining more than marble. It stains his faith in his ability to belong. He is haunted by questions that echo louder than applause. Am I doing more harm than good? Do they even want me here? And yet, when those he loved are threatened, he cannot stop himself from intervening. That, perhaps, is his greatest weakness, his compassion. The two figures, circling each other like predators in the dark, finally begin to move toward collision. The trap is set, meticulously woven by the hidden puppeteer. Hostages are taken, lives dangled in the balance, and suddenly the god is forced into a corner. He is told he must confront the mortal or watch the innocent perish. And so, unwillingly, with a heavy heart, he flies toward the confrontation he never wanted. The meeting between them is not quiet. It is thunder. Armor clashes with flesh. Fists shatter walls. The ground trembles beneath their fury. For a moment, it feels like myth come alive, like watching Achilles and Hector on the plains of Troy, or Gilgamesh battling Enkidu in the ancient epics. The mortal fights with ferocity born of obsession, wielding weapons designed to pierce even the flesh of a god. And for a time, he holds the advantage. His armor glints in the firelight, his traps spring with cruel precision, and he manages what once seemed impossible. He makes the god bleed. But the battle is not merely physical. It is fueled by centuries of human resentment and millennia of divine detachment. Every punch is loaded with philosophy, every strike an argument about the nature of power. The mortal shouts that gods cannot be trusted, that unchecked power is a curse. The god tries, between blows, to explain, to reason, to show that he never wanted this fight. Yet rage drowns reason, and the clash escalates until it seems one must fall for the other to rise. And then, in a moment that shifts everything, the god utters a name, a human name, a mother's name. It pierces through the armor of vengeance, jolting the mortal into a realization he had not expected. For the first time, he sees his enemy not as a god, but as a man. Someone who bleeds, someone who fears, someone whose love for his mother mirrors his own long-buried grief. The battle halts, not with decisive strike, but with a disarming recognition of shared humanity. It is a moment almost Shakespearean in its irony. The very thing that divides them, their opposing natures, collapses under the simple bond of love for a parent. But the story does not pause for long. In the shadows, the true architect of this chaos reveals his hand. His plan was never simply to pit man against God. It was to unleash something far more destructive. From the corpse of a fallen warrior, from forbidden science and twisted ambition, he creates a monster, a creature born of hubris, a grotesque fusion of power and rage. Its roar shakes the night. Its strength eclipses even that of the god. Suddenly, the two former enemies must turn allies, their feud abandoned in the face of a greater terror. The battle that follows is apocalyptic. The creature rampages through the city, a thing of pure destruction. Every blow it lands leveling buildings and sending shockwaves across streets already scarred by past wars. The mortal, for all his armor and weapons, realizes his limits. His strength lies not in matching gods, but in strategy and endurance, in courage that refuses to bend even when dwarfed by monstrous power. And so he fights, but he knows this is not a battle he can win alone. Then from the smoke, she arrives, a warrior unlike either of them, ancient yet timeless, stepping into the chaos with a calm smile that speaks of someone who has seen horrors before and has never run from them. Her armor gleams, her sword cuts through shadows, and her presence electrifies the air. Together, the three of them form a reluctant trinity, each bringing their own strengths into the fight against a creature that seems unstoppable. The battle surges with moments of triumph and despair. Lightning crackles, fire blazes, screams echo. The god hurls himself again and again into the fight, his body battered, his strength tested to the breaking point. The warrior's blade cuts deep, her shield deflecting blows that would crush stone. The mortal fires his last desperate weapons, knowing that each second bought may be the one that allows his allies to strike harder. It is chaotic, messy, terrifying, and it feels less like a superhero spectacle and more like an ancient war retold in modern myth. And then comes the choice, the sacrifice. The god realizes that only he can end this, but the cost will be unbearable. Carrying the weapon that can kill the beast also means carrying the weapon that can kill himself. Yet he does not hesitate. He launches forward, driving the blade into the heart of the monster, even as the creature's claws pierce his own body. The two fall together, locked in fatal embrace, and silence spreads across the battlefield. The aftermath is not triumph. It is grief. The god lies still lifeless, and the world that once doubted him now mourns him. Crowds gather, vigils are lit, words of sorrow fill the air. The mortal, who once vowed to destroy him, now stands in solemn respect, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what his hatred nearly cost. The warrior, who has returned from centuries of hiding, walks among the mourners with quiet dignity, her eyes carrying the burden of wars past and wars yet to come. But even in grief, there are whispers of hope. As the coffin is lowered, as flags drape over the symbol of sacrifice, the earth itself stirs. A grain of soil lifts, trembling, as though refusing to accept finality. The story does not end in death. It ends in mystery, in the lingering promise that legends never truly vanish. When I think back on this story, it isn't the explosions or even the colossal battles that linger most vividly. It is the people, or rather, the archetypes of people that haunt the imagination. Each character feels less like a flat figure moving through a screenplay and more like an embodiment of philosophy, a myth reborn in modern garb. Their choices, their silences, their flaws, all of it seems to echo questions humanity has been asking since the beginning of literature. The man in the shadows, for instance, the one who wears his grief like armor, is no ordinary mortal. His story begins in loss, in the gunshot that tore away innocence in a cold alley. He grows not just into adulthood, but into vengeance itself, sculpting his body, sharpening his mind, bending every ounce of it toward one singular mission: to control chaos by becoming a force even more terrifying than chaos. By the time we meet him here, his years have hardened him. His methods are brutal. His compassion has been eroded by decades of rage. What fascinates me most is how his paranoia transforms into philosophy. He convinces himself that no power, especially one beyond human comprehension, can go unchecked. This paranoia makes him cruel, makes him blind, and yet paradoxically, it also makes him human. Who among us, if faced with God walking among men, would not tremble at the thought of betrayal? He becomes embodiment of humanity's fear of irrelevance, of being overpowered, of losing control. Opposite him stands a God who never wanted to be worshipped. His tragedy is not that he is too powerful, but that he is too different. Imagine, for a moment, carrying the ability to lift mountains, yet still being crushed by loneliness. He saved because it is his nature to save, yet every act of heroism widens a chasm between himself and those he protects. What I find so moving about him is his quiet vulnerability. He tries to live as a man, working, loving, mourning, but the whispers never stop. For some, he is hope incarnate. For others, a ticking bomb. His conflict is not whether he can be good, but whether the world will ever allow him to be seen as good. When he doubts himself, when he looks down at his hands after another tragedy, we glimpse the unbearable truth of power. It does not shield one from alienation, it magnifies it. And then, in between these two titans, we find the puppeteer. He is not driven by grief or isolation, but by something far more unsettling: delight in chaos. Where the mortal sees fear and the god sees burden, he sees opportunity. His brilliance is undeniable, his manipulation exquisite. He moves through the story like a trickster out of ancient myth, smiling, laughing, yet pulling threads that unravel entire worlds. What fascinates me is that he is not simply mad for the sake of madness. His envy is almost biblical. He cannot stand the existence of gods because their very presence reminds him of his own smallness. And so, with cunning and cruelty, he twists events so that gods and men destroy one another. His weapon is not strength, but words, influence, suggestion. And in that sense, he feels more terrifying than any physical monster. And then, suddenly, there is her, the warrior who steps into the light when the world needs her most. For centuries she has remained apart, silent, observing, perhaps even weary of mankind's endless cycle of war. But when she finally enters the battlefield, it is with the calm assurance of someone who has seen it all before. What strikes me about her presence is how it reframes everything. She is neither paranoid like the mortal nor alienated like the god. She knows exactly what she is and what she stands for. There's a kind of ancient serenity in her smile as she clashes with the beast, as if reminding the men around her that the burden of heroism was never theirs alone to carry. She is both warrior and poet, someone whose scars are hidden beneath elegance, whose laughter during battle tells us she does not fear the abyss. Yet the story would not be complete without looking at those who surround these larger-than-life figures. The woman who loves a god, for instance, grounds him in humanity. She is his anchor, the reminder that even gods crave connection. Her courage is often overlooked. She throws herself into danger not because she has powers, but because she believes in him, in truth, in justice as more than slogans. Her presence in the narrative reminds us that the question is not just whether humanity can trust gods, but whether gods can trust humanity enough to love them back. The butler, the confidant of the mortal, is another figure worth lingering on. Wry, cynical, and endlessly loyal, he is the voice of reason whispering into the ear of a man consumed by obsession. His sarcasm hides deep affection. His resignation hides a lifetime of shared scars. In him we see the quiet tragedy of those who stand beside heroes, carrying their burdens silently, shaping their choices with small but steady hands. Even the public, the faceless crowds, the fearful onlookers, the chanting worshippers, become characters in their own right. They are the chorus of this modern epic, mirroring the divided heart of humanity. Some raise altars, some carry protest signs, some kneel, some spit in defiance. Through them, the film reflects us, the audience, and our own inability to unite in the face of the unknown. And then there is the monster, born not of nature, but of hubris. It is grotesque, terrifying, destructive. But what makes it haunting is not its physical form, but what it represents. It is man's attempt to control gods, to play creator, and in doing so, to unleash something that defies control. It is not merely a creature. It is metaphor, the embodiment of what happens when envy and fear twist into creation without wisdom. Its roar is the echo of our own arrogance. Each of these characters, when viewed not as individuals but as parts of literary tapestry, form an epic far greater than their costumes suggest. The mortal is Prometheus, stealing fire to keep gods at bay. The god is Hercules, torn between divinity and humanity. The puppeteer is Loki, the trickster sowing discord. The warrior is Athena, stepping into battle with wisdom and grace. And the humans, the chorus, the lovers, the mentors, are us watching, fearing, hoping. Together, they tell not just a superhero story, but a myth retold in modern language, reminding us that our deepest conflicts are not new at all. By the end, what lingers is not who won or who lost, but how these characters reveal the timeless struggle between fear and hope, control and faith, vengeance and forgiveness. They are not simply characters in a film. They are reflections of ourselves, of the archetypes we return to in every age, in every story, because they capture the questions we cannot stop asking. Every film carries with it a secret history, a parallel story unfolding behind the cameras, in quiet studios, on sleepless sets, in whispered conversations between crew members. And with this particular film, the strangeness wasn't confined to the screen. It seeped into the making of it, shaping it in ways that feel almost as dramatic as the story it told. What I find most fascinating is how much of this film's identity was decided long before the first shot was even filmed. It began as something else, a continuation of one man's journey in red and blue, a sequel that would explore what it means for the world to wrestle with a god among men. But as conversations in boardrooms swirled and ambitions grew bolder, the film expanded, mutated, almost like the monster would eventually depict. It became not only a sequel, but a foundation stone, the keystone for an entire universe of films yet to be. That ambition weighed heavily. You can almost sense it in every frame. The film doesn't just want to tell one story. It wants to carry the burden of 1,000 possible futures. That weight shaped the production, creating both brilliance and controversy. One of the strangest details I love is how the actors themselves became part of this mythology before cameras even rolled. When the casting of the mortal in the shadows was announced, the world erupted. Too old, some said. Too strange a choice, others argued. But behind the scenes, the actor threw himself into the role with almost obsessive dedication. He trained relentlessly, carving his body into a figure both scarred and powerful, a man who could believably stand against gods. Rumor has it that even during downtime on set, he would brood in character, carrying the weight of paranoia like a second skin. Crew members whispered about his intensity, how he seemed less like a movie star, and more like a man genuinely convinced the world was on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, the god in blue had his own strange rituals. To embody a being caught between divinity and humanity, he had to maintain a physique that bordered on impossible. Trainers described his routine as punishing, his diet meticulous. There are stories of him sitting quietly between takes, headphones in, not listening to bombastic music, but to gentle, almost mournful tracks, as though reminding himself that his power came with loneliness. It is odd to think that even in the artificial world of cinema, actors search for ways to feel the emotional truths of their characters, carrying burdens that echo long after the cameras stop. But perhaps the strangest presence of all was the trickster, the puppeteer in the narrative. The actor chosen for this role delved so deeply into the mindset of chaos that the crew found him unpredictable. He would improvise lines, alter deliveries, twist scenes in directions no one expected. Sometimes it was frustrating, but more often it created moments of unsettling brilliance. There are whispers that even the director encouraged this unpredictability, wanting the actor to embody not just a written villain, but the spirit of disruption itself, infecting the set with the same unease as character spreads through the story. Outside the actors, the production itself gathered strange stories like storm clouds. The scale of destruction required entire city blocks to be built only to be torn down, creating a surreal environment where cast and crew walked through streets that looked both real and unreal at once. Extras described the eerie feeling of running from collapsing buildings that weren't truly collapsing, dust filling their lungs as machines simulated apocalypse. For days, they lived inside a nightmare recreation catastrophe, and when the director called cut, they returned to trailers still coughing from the fake debris. It blurred the line between performance and reality. Even more bizarre were the debates that unfolded over the smallest details. The design of armor, for instance, went through endless iterations. How much should it resemble comic book pages? How much should it feel grounded, as though it could truly exist in our world? Designers spoke of late nights spent sketching, arguing, scrapping, rebuilding. Every line on a mask, every edge of a gauntlet carried the burden of fan expectation and artistic vision colliding. It may seem trivial, but those debates shaped the look of a character who needed to feel both mythical and believable. The music, too, has its share of odd tales. Two composers work together, blending radically different styles, one favoring bombast, the other favoring restraint. The result is a score that sometimes sounds like clashing worlds in itself. Pounding drums that feel like war, delicate strings that whisper tragedy. There are stories of the recording sessions where the orchestra would play notes so thunderous that the sound seemed to vibrate through the walls, leaving even hardened technicians wide-eyed. The music became almost a character in its own right, breathing life into the myth. Perhaps the strangest fact of all is how much secrecy surrounded the production. Scripts were locked away, scenes filmed under code names, props hidden in plain boxes, so that no outsider could catch a glimpse. Yet, despite all the secrecy, leaks happened. Concept art surfacing online, plot rumors spreading like wildfire. It created a bizarre double life of the film, one in which it was unfolding quietly on set, and another in which it was dissected wildly across the internet by people who had seen nothing but whispers. That tension only added to the myth surrounding its release. And then there were the accidents, the unexpected moments that colored the making of the film. A stunt that went slightly wrong, sending an actor crashing harder than expected, leaving real bruises that later appeared on screen as part of the character's pain. A camera malfunction during a key sequence that forced the team to improvise, leading to shots more haunting than what was originally planned. These accidents remind me of how often in art, the most unforgettable moments are not designed but discovered, born of chaos. By the time the film reached audiences, it carried with it all these hidden stories. The actors' obsessions, the crew's sleepless debates, the accidents and improvisations, the secrecy and leaks. Watching it now, knowing these details, adds another layer of fascination. The film itself becomes a strange hybrid, part myth, part accident, part ambition too large for any single story to contain. And maybe that's why it still lingers, still divides, still fascinates. Because behind every frame lies a strangeness, a reminder that art is not made in tidy, controlled spaces. It is born of chaos, ambition, obsession, and sometimes sheer accident. This film, more than most, carries that truth like a scar. And for those who look closely, the scars are as interesting as the story itself. When we look at the great works of literature, we often remember not just the characters or the language, but the pivotal moments, the events that define the story, that turn the tide, that burn themselves into memory because they embody an idea larger than the plot itself. This film, though cloaked in the spectacle of modern cinema, is no different. Its events feel almost ritualistic, as though each one were designed to provoke not just reaction but reflection. The first such moment arrives in a cloud of dust and terror, the destruction of a city under divine battle. We've seen cities fall on screen before, yet here the perspective shifts. We do not soar above the chaos as spectators of grandeur. We stand on the ground, choking on smoke, running from collapsing buildings, watching as people we love vanish into rubble. It is not a scene of action but of trauma, and that distinction matters. Literature often teaches us that perspective alters meaning. The Iliad is not just about the glory of battle, but about the cries of the dying. In the same way, this event reframes what might have been heroic battle into a tragedy of human frailty. It asks us, how do mortals perceive gods when their presence brings destruction as often as salvation? Another event, quieter but no less profound, is the trial of accountability, the hearing in which humanity gathers to demand answers from the being they cannot fully trust. This moment resonates with the weight of history, echoing every tribunal, every inquisition, every courtroom where mortals have attempted to hold power accountable. Yet what happens? An explosion, sudden and merciless, obliterates the very possibility of dialogue. The god survives untouched, while humans are reduced to ash. The symbolism is devastating. Justice, reason, and accountability are consumed in fire before they can even take shape. And the silence that follows is not just cinematic, it is philosophical. It whispers the futility of trying to contain power with words alone. This single event becomes a fulcrum of mistrust, a turning point that pushes immortal and shadows further into obsession. Then comes the nightmare sequence, strange and apocalyptic, a dream or a vision of a future enslaved beneath divine heel. Paramilitary forces, scorched earth, banners bearing alien symbols. It feels less like a superhero fantasy and more like a dystopian prophecy. What matters is not whether it is real or imagined, but how it functions as metaphor. It is literature disguised as cinema, a projection of fear, the embodiment of paranoia so deep it feels prophetic. Here the story reflects our own anxieties. What happens when those we empower become our oppressors? Is it inevitable that saviors become tyrants? The scene lingers because it does not answer but unsettles, like a passage from Kafka or Orwell. The confrontation between man and God, of course, is the centerpiece, the event upon which the entire narrative pivots. Yet what makes it extraordinary is not the clash of fists and weapons, but the intrusion of a single word, a mother's name. It is almost absurd in its simplicity, and yet it redefines everything. In literature, moments of recognition or anagnorisis often shift the course of tragedy. Here, the mortal realizes that his enemy bleeds not just blood but humanity, that he loves, fears, and mourns like any man. This recognition collapses hatred into reluctant compassion, vengeance into alliance. It is a moment that critics often mock for its bluntness, yet in literary terms, it functions as a turning point rich with irony. The very thing that divides them, the godhood of one and the mortality of the other, is bridged by the most ordinary of bonds, love for a mother. And then, from manipulation and hubris, emerges the monster. This creation is not just a plot device, but a symbol of what happens when envy and fear drive men to play creator. Literature is filled with such warnings. From Frankenstein's monster to the golem, humanity's attempt to fashion power always birth destruction. The creature's rampage through the city is not simply spectacle. It is allegory, the embodiment of unrestrained ambition. Its roar is the voice of every empire that thought itself invincible, every scientist who crossed a line without considering consequence. Watching it tear through the night, we are not just entertained, we are warned. The final sacrifice, the god choosing to impale himself along with the beast, resonates with themes older than civilization. It is the Christ-like offering, the martyr who dies not because he is weak, but because he loves too deeply to let others suffer. What fascinates me most here is how the narrative does not present this as glorious triumph. It is tragedy. The people who once doubted him now weep for him, recognizing his humanity only in death. This mirrors countless literary arcs where characters are misunderstood until their sacrifice reveals their truth. In that sense, the ending is not just emotional but moral. It reminds us that trust, once broken, often comes too late. Even the closing moments, the silent grain of soil rising from the coffin, are more than a cliffhanger. It is a symbol, a whisper of resurrection, echoing myth after myth of gods who do not stay dead. From Osiris to Christ to countless literary heroes, death is never the end but the threshold to transformation. The soil rising is not just a tease for sequels. It is a literary gesture, a promise that stories, like myths, never truly end. What fascinates me about all these events, when strung together, is how they resist the neatness of typical cinematic arcs. There is no pure victory, no unambiguous triumph. Every moment carries paradox, rescue that feels like invasion, trials that end in silence, fights that resolve in recognition rather than conquest, sacrifices that feel both necessary and unbearable. This is why the film lingers in the mind like a complex novel rather than a disposable blockbuster. It demands rereading, reviewing, reinterpretation. Critics often argue about tone, about coherence, about pacing. But from a literary perspective, these so-called flaws become features. The heaviness mirrors the weight of epic tragedy. The disjointed pacing reflects the fractured nature of a world unsure of what it believes. The solemnity is not accidental but deliberate, echoing the seriousness with which ancient myths were told. Each event, each moment, carries the gravity of allegory. And so, when I revisit these scenes, I don't see just a film. I see literature unfolding in moving images. I see parables disguised as action, metaphors disguised as spectacle, tragedies disguised as entertainment. The events may belong to a superhero film, but their resonance belongs to the same tradition that gave us Homer, Milton, and Shakespeare. And that, perhaps, is why they endure. Every film has two lives, the one the audience sees on screen and the one that unfolds in fragments behind the camera. Sometimes the hidden life is as fascinating as the final product, and with this film, the hidden life feels almost as epic as the story it tells. The production stretched across years, across continents, across endless debates about tone, design, and vision. The result was not only a finished film, but a collection of stories, oddities, and insights that reveal just how enormous and unpredictable filmmaking can be. The very conception of the project was a kind of battle. In the wake of one film that introduced the God in Blue to the modern age, there was a question of where to go next. Some envisioned a quiet continuation of that story, focused on rebuilding trust between humanity and a savior. Others saw an opportunity to lay the foundation for something larger, a universe of interconnected stories, rivaling myths of ancient pantheons but retold through capes and masks. What emerged was a compromise, a film that would be both sequel and prologue, both intimate and sprawling. That ambition set the tone for everything that followed. Casting was one of the earliest points of tension. The decision to bring in a new mortal protector, older, scarred, weary, was a departure from the youthful, idealized versions audiences had grown used to. When the announcement came, the world reacted with disbelief, even ridicule. But behind the scenes, the choice was deliberate. The director wanted a man who looked like he had carried battles for decades, whose body could be a map of scars, whose eyes carried exhaustion as much as fury. The actor chose and accepted the challenge with intensity, transforming himself physically and mentally into a figure who could believably prepare for war with a god. Trainers described his dedication as relentless. He wanted to convince not just a camera, but himself that he could stand against impossible odds. The God in Blue, meanwhile, had already proven his presence in the previous film. But here the challenge was different. His story was no longer about discovery, but about alienation, and the actor leaned into this melancholy. Crew members remember how he would remain quiet between takes, headphones on, as though trying to hold on to the loneliness of his character. It created a contrast on set, the mortal brooding with rage, the god brooding with isolation. Even off camera, their energies clashed in ways that mirrored the story. Then there was a warrior, introduced here for the first time in the cinematic tapestry. The decision to bring her in was bold, even risky, because it meant weaving a third myth into an already heavy narrative. The actress embraced the role with both discipline and joy, throwing herself into combat training, mastering swordplay and shield work, but also bringing a smile that lit up the set during grueling night shoots. Crew members spoke of how her presence lifted spirits, especially during the exhausting final battle sequences. She became not just a character, but a kind of morale anchor, reminding everyone that beneath the weight of myth, filmmaking could still be fun. One of the most fascinating aspects of production was the scale of practical effects. While modern films rely heavily on digital imagery, this one often insisted on building physical sets, on creating tangible environments that actors could inhabit. Entire city blocks were recreated, only to be destroyed piece by piece during filming. Extras described the surreal feeling of running through streets that looked indistinguishably real, ducking under falling rubble while massive wind machines blasted dust and debris around them. 4 days at a time, they lived inside an artificial apocalypse. And when the director called cut, many admitted they had to remind themselves it wasn't real. But of course, digital effects played their role too, and here the fun facts abound. The monster at the climax was designed and redesigned countless times, with early sketches looking nothing like the final product. Some versions were too human, others too alien, until finally a grotesque balance was struck, a creature that felt like a violation of nature itself. Animators spoke of layering detail after detail, making sure its movements felt both animalistic and unnatural, as though every step carried the weight of something born wrong. The music, too, has its share of behind-the-scenes marvels. 2 composers, each with distinct styles, collaborated to craft a soundscape. One favored thunder, drums, brass, sweeping scores that shook theaters. The other leaned toward minimalism, using quiet notes to suggest sorrow and weight. Their collaboration was not always smooth. Arguments reportedly broke out about tone, about how heroic or how tragic a scene should feel. Yet the clash of styles created a score unlike any other, one that felt as divided and conflicted as the story itself. On set, there were lighter moments too. The mortal's armor was notoriously uncomfortable, so much so that between takes he often had to be helped out of it just to sit or breathe properly. Crew members joked about the irony of a man meant to stand toe-to-toe with gods struggling to bend his knees, or drink water without assistance. The god suit, though less cumbersome, came with its own challenges. It had to be constantly adjusted under hot lights, every wrinkle smoothed, every emblem shining. More than once, the actor quipped about feeling less like a savior and more like a mannequin. Perhaps one of the strangest production quirks was the secrecy. Scripts were printed on special paper to prevent photocopying. Scenes were filmed under false titles, and props were hidden in ordinary containers. Crew members had to sign layers of agreements promising silence. Despite all this, leaks still happened, fueling speculation across the internet. Some leaks turned out to be accurate, others wildly false, but the secrecy created a strange dual world. On set, people worked in silence, while online, fans debated conspiracies about events they hadn't yet seen. And then there were the accidents. One stunt involving the mortal leaping from a crumbling structure went wrong, leading to bruises that lingered for weeks. Rather than reshoot, the director embraced the authenticity, allowing the actor's real pain to feed into the character's exhaustion. Another time, a camera malfunction forced a change in angles during a dramatic scene, resulting in shots that many critics later praised for their haunting intimacy. These accidents became part of the film's DNA, unplanned but irreplaceable. The director himself became a central figure in the production's mythology. Known for his meticulous visual style, he was said to storyboard nearly every shot, approaching the film as though it were a graphic novel come to life. Crew members described walls plastered with sketches, sequences laid out frame by frame, before a single scene was filmed. This precision sometimes frustrated those who wanted more spontaneity, but also gave the film its signature look. Every frame composed like a painting, every shadow deliberate. Yet for all its control, the production was often chaotic. Shooting schedules stretched late into the night, weather disrupted outdoor sequences. Budgets swelled under the weight of ambition. At one point, an entire sequence had to be relocated due to unexpected restrictions, forcing the team to improvise with sets and lighting. It was exhausting, and yet many crew members later admitted it was also exhilarating, like participating in the creation of modern myth, even if it nearly broke them. By the time filming wrapped, everyone involved seemed transformed. The actors had carried their characters not just on screen, but into their own bodies, their own moods. The crew had built and destroyed worlds, balancing practical chaos with digital invention. The composers had battled over sound until their clashing visions fused into something unforgettable. And through it all, the director had kept his eyes fixed on a vision larger than any one film, as though aware that they were not just making a movie, but contributing to a saga that would be argued about for years. Looking back, the fun facts and strange insights are not trivial. They are part of the story. They reveal how much labor, accident, conflict, and creativity go into shaping a myth. They remind us that what we see on screen is only the final layer of a long, messy process. And perhaps that is fitting because this film itself is about chaos and order, hope and fear, destruction and creation. Its production mirrored its themes, unfolding not with neatness but with struggle, obsession, and flashes of brilliance. What always strikes me about this film is how much the settings themselves feel like characters. They aren't just places where events happen. They breathe, they resonate, they speak in their own silent language. Each location is chosen not for convenience, but for symbolism, for the emotional tone it adds to the story. It is as if the filmmakers were painting with cities, with ruins, with skylines, crafting a canvas upon which gods and mortals could collide. Take the opening destruction, for example. The city in ruins is not just rubble. It is trauma etched into architecture. When skyscrapers bend and towers crumble, we are reminded that civilization is fragile, that glass and steel cannot stand against divine power. The dust that coats the survivors is not simply debris, but a kind of baptism, a transformation into witnesses of a new age. Literature has long understood the power of ruined cities, from Troy to Babylon to Dante's visions of hell. And here, the ruined city becomes a soil in which paranoia grows. Then there's a contrast between two urban giants, the city of light and the city of shadows. One gleams with financial towers, political chambers, and sunlight reflecting off rivers. The other is cloaked in perpetual darkness, alleys littered with crime, its skyline jagged and hostile. They are neighbors, divided only by a stretch of water, and yet they could not be more different. This duality is more than geographic. It is thematic. The bright city represents aspiration, idealism, the hope of progress. The shadowed city embodies trauma, distrust, the scars of crime. Together, they form a kind of modern yin and yang, a symbolic landscape where hope and fear live side by side. The interiors are just as telling. Consider the mansion of the mortal in shadows. It is not the warm, Gothic home we sometimes imagine, filled with relics and memories. Here, it is stripped bare, almost skeletal. The house feels abandoned, a hollow shell that mirrors the emptiness of its inhabitant. He does not live there so much as haunted. The emptiness of his home tells us more than words could. His life is consumed by decay below, by obsession, by shadows. In literature, homes often mirror souls, and here the mansion is a hollow reflection of a man hollowed by grief. By contrast, the farm where the god was raised radiates a different tone. Wide fields, golden light, and open sky. It is the embodiment of simplicity, of humanity, of the ordinary life he can never fully return to. Whenever the story shifts to this place, it feels like inhaling after drowning in the claustrophobia of cities. Yet even this setting is tinged with sorrow. The farm is not a refuge, but a reminder of what cannot last, of a family fragile and vulnerable in a world of titans. It is pastoral, yes, but it is also mortal. One of the most haunting settings is the courtroom. Its columns and wood-paneled walls echo centuries of human attempts to structure justice. Here, humanity gathers in hope that law and order can tame divinity. Yet when fire consumes it, the architecture itself becomes symbolic. The shattering of that chamber is a shattering of accountability. the collapse of reason under the weight of terror. It is as though the film is telling us that the walls of human institutions are too thin to contain gods. Then there are the dreamscapes, the visions, a desert wasteland, banners fluttering with alien symbols, soldiers kneeling in false reverence, the world scorched into obedience. These settings are not real in the narrative sense, yet they carry as much weight as any physical location. They are landscapes of fear, painted from paranoia. They recall the surrealism of Dante or Blake, visions where reality bends to reveal truths of the soul. The very unreliability of these landscapes makes them powerful. They are not geography but psychology, a cartography of dread. And what of the final battlefield? A wasteland of fire and ruin, glowing with unnatural light. Here, architecture collapses into rubble. Streets become craters and the sky itself feels poisoned. This is not a city anymore, but a stage for apocalypse. The choice of location reflects the stakes. When gods and monsters clash, civilization itself dissolves. Yet amid this chaos, one figure stands gleaming in ancient armor, another struggles forward in battered metal, and a third hurls himself against doom. The setting amplifies their myth, making their fight feel less like action and more like ritual. Cinematography plays its own role in shaping these settings into meaning. Shadows dominate. Light rarely falls unbroken. Scenes are framed with a painter's precision, as though every image were meant to hang in a gallery. The camera lingers on destruction not for spectacle but for impact. Faces coated in ash, eyes wide with fear, hands reaching out in helplessness. These images echo the compositions of war photography, grounding myth in the reality of human suffering. Symbolism is everywhere in the visual elements. Statues loom, their faces cracked and broken, representing the fragility of worship. Rain pours down during moment of confrontation, baptizing combatants in nature's tears. Fire glows in the background of rage, while candlelight flickers in moments of mourning. Even color itself is deliberate. Muted tones dominate, broken occasionally by flashes of bright red or golden light. It is as though the film's palette mirrors the uncertainty of its world, where hope struggles to pierce through gray despair. Sound, too, enhances the atmosphere of these settings. The creak of wood in abandoned halls, the roar of collapsing steel, the silence that follows explosions, all are chosen to linger in the psyche. Silence, especially, becomes its own setting, as when the courtroom falls into deathly stillness after blast. It is not emptiness but presence, the weight of absence pressing down like a stone. Perhaps the most overlooked element is how the film uses verticality. Gods ascend from the skies, mortals stand on rooftops glaring upward. Cities tower only to collapse downward. The relationship between ground and sky becomes symbolic. Humans looking up with awe or fear, gods ascending into worlds that cannot contain them. It reminds me of ancient literature, where Olympus looms above mortals, where heaven and earth remain forever divided. The settings here recreate that cosmic divide through architecture, skyline, and camera angle. By the end of the film, the settings tell their own story. The ruined city whispers of trauma that births paranoia. The farm reminds us of fragile humanity. The courtroom reveals a failure of institutions. The wasteland shows us fear painted as prophecy. The battlefield tells us that when titans clash, civilization crumbles. None of these are random. They are deliberate choices, visual metaphors crafted to turn place into philosophy. This is why the film lingers. It is not just characters we remember, but spaces, the dust-choked streets, the cavernous halls, the sunlit fields, the burning wastelands. These are not mere backdrops. They are poetry written in architecture and light. And like all great settings in literature, they remind us that where a story happens is as important as what happens. Every film carries two layers of story. The one we see on screen and the one whispered to the hallways of studios, shared in tired laughter between takes, remembered in bruises, sweat, and odd accidents. If the finished film feels like a myth, then the behind-the-scenes story feels like a human counterpoint. Ordinary people working under extraordinary pressure, stumbling into accidents, surprising themselves with bursts of brilliance. What first strikes me about the set of this film is the sheer tension in the air, not of hostility, but of weight. Everyone knew they were making not just a movie but a cornerstone, a foundation for a sprawling universe. The director himself often reminded cast and crew that they weren't simply telling one story. They were shaping myth. This sense of magnitude created both awe and exhaustion. You could feel it in the way people carried themselves, shoulders heavy, eyes burning with intensity. The actors inhabited their roles so deeply that the line between character and self blurred. The Mortal Protector, for instance, walked around the set with the same brooding silence he carried in character. Crew members whispered about how rarely he broke into laughter, how even during downtime he seemed locked in a headspace of paranoia. Some said it was method acting. Others thought it was simply his way of surviving the pressure. Whatever the reason, his intensity bled into every scene, giving performance its sharp edge. By contrast, the God in Blue carried himself with quiet reserve. Between takes, he wasn't loud or commanding. Instead, he seemed contemplative, often sitting alone, headphones on, as though listening not to hype but to sorrowful melodies that kept him grounded in his character's isolation. One crew member remarked that watching him offset felt almost uncanny. He radiated the same distance his character does, as though the loneliness was real and not just acted. The warrior, however, brought a completely different energy. She was light, laughter, and charm, a counterbalance to the heaviness of the other two leads. During grueling fight sequences filmed at night, she would crack jokes, share smiles, and rally the tired crew. Stunt performers adored her because she threw herself fully into training, often asking to do more of her own action than safety guidelines technically allowed. There are stories of her returning home covered in bruises, shrugging them off with pride, saying they were marks of authenticity. One of the most fascinating interactions on set was between the actors playing the mortal and the god. They rarely joked together, rarely broke the serious atmosphere between them. Crew members noticed how even casual conversations felt layered with tension, as if both were subconsciously rehearsing the rivalry their characters carried. And yet, when cameras rolled, that unspoken distance paid off. Their clashes felt real because, in some ways, the actors never allowed themselves to grow too comfortable with one another. The puppeteer of the story, the trickster, was unpredictable in an entirely different way. On set, he was a wild card, improvising lines, shifting his tone, bringing a manic energy that sometimes startled his co-stars. The director encouraged this, urging him to disrupt, to infect scenes with unpredictability. Some days the crew rolled their eyes at his antics. Other days they stood stunned, realizing he created a moment far more haunting than the script could have delivered. That volatility mirrored his character perfectly. The challenges faced by the crew were immense. Whole city blocks had to be built, dressed, and then partially demolished to simulate catastrophe. For extras, this meant days of running through smoke, coughing as debris machines filled the air with ash. One extra described it as living inside a nightmare painting, with a line between acting and reality blurred. After hours of filming collapse after collapse, many walked back to their trailers in stunned silence, their minds still half-trapped in the artificial apocalypse. Stunt performers, too, carried their share of pain. There were accidents, minor injuries, unexpected falls, bruises that spread across ribs and shoulders. Yet these bruises became part of the film itself. When the mortal stumbles, limping with exhaustion, some of that pain was genuine. When the god crashes through rubble and winces, the wince was not entirely performance. These physical scars became invisible ink, written into the texture of the story. The director's presence was everywhere, and the crew often joked that he wasn't just filming a movie, but painting one frame at a time. Walls were covered in sketches and storyboards, whole sequences drawn out before cameras even rolled. His obsession with imagery sometimes stretched days longer than expected. A shot of sunlight breaking through clouds, for instance, required multiple takes across multiple days until it matched the vision in his head. Crew members groaned, but when the final footage played back, the silence in the room spoke volumes. It was as if a painting had come alive. There were also moments of unexpected levity. During one night shoot, when exhaustion hung heavy, the actor in the god's suit pretended to fly in slow motion across set between takes, arms stretched out, face mock serious, sending the crew into rare laughter. Another time, the warrior picked up one of the prop swords and began mock choreographing a dance with a cameraman, easing tension that had been building for hours. These glimpses of humor reminded everyone that beneath the myth they were constructing, they were still just people, tired but passionate, trying to make art. What fascinates me most is how secrecy shaped the behind-the-scenes atmosphere. Scripts were guarded like sacred texts, passed out only in fragments, sometimes with entire pages redacted. Even the actors weren't always told the full scope of scenes outside their own. This secrecy created strange moments of discovery. One actor admitted he didn't fully understand the climactic battle until he saw the finished cut, because on set, he had been acting against green screens and unfinished monsters. In a way, the cast experienced the story's revelations along with the audience, piece by piece. The final battle sequence became a kind of crucible for the entire production. Shot over weeks in difficult conditions, it demanded coordination between stunt teams, visual effects crews, pyrotechnics, and exhausted actors. Night after night, fire lit the set, explosions rattled the ground, and cameras caught faces streaked with sweat and grime. Many later described it as the most punishing part of the shoot, but also the most unifying. By the end, when the god falls in sacrifice, even the crew standing behind cameras felt the weight of loss. Some admitted to tears, not just because of the story, but because the journey of making it had been so consuming. When filming wrapped, there was a strange silence. Cast and crew had lived inside this myth for so long that stepping out of it felt disorienting. The mortal shaved away the bulk he had built, shedding the armor of obsession. The god left behind the cape, though for months afterward, fans still called him by the name of his character. The warrior prepared to carry her story into the future, her laughter already echoing into new projects. And the crew, tired and proud, carried with them the knowledge that they had helped create not just a film but a legend, one stitched together by sweat, accident, laughter, and scars. And maybe that's what behind-the-scenes stories remind us, that myths are born not of perfection, but of imperfection. They are forged in long nights, in broken props, in actors struggling through exhaustion, in directors obsessing over sunlight, in bruises that sting long after the cameras stop. What we see on screen is polished, mythic, larger than life. But behind it stands a small army of human beings, flawed and brilliant, stumbling and rising, creating something that will outlast them, and that, in its own way, is as mythic as the story itself. What lingers most in this film is not just a spectacle, not just the thunder of battles or the weight of destruction, but the ideas woven beneath them. It is a work built like a tapestry, every thread carrying meaning, every image doubling as metaphor. The more one sits with it, the more it begins to feel less like a superhero tale and more like a modern myth wrestling with themes as old as literature itself. At its core, the film is about fear and trust. Humanity has always feared what it does not understand, and the arrival of a godlike being becomes the ultimate test of that fear. Early in the story, we see faces turn upward in awe and terror, people asking not whether he can save them, but whether he should. This tension mirrors a relationship between mortals and gods in ancient epics. In Homer, men feared Zeus as much as they revered him. In Milton, humanity trembled before divine will. Here, the same question is reframed in modern terms. If a savior appears among us, does he bring liberation or subjugation? Fear corrodes trust, and mistrust becomes paranoia, fueling the mortal's descent into obsession. The theme is not confined to characters, but woven into the entire fabric of the story, through ruins, through protests, through whispered prayers. Closely tied to this is a theme of power and accountability. Power in itself is not the problem. It is what power does to relationships, to trust, to structures of justice. The god in blue wants to use his power for good, yet every action he takes ripples outward, creating consequences he cannot predict or control. A hearing in a grand chamber, meant to hold him accountable, explodes into silence. The mortal in shadows believes accountability must be taken by force, that only through preemptive violence can humanity balance the scales. This tension reflects one of literature's oldest questions: who guard the guardians? From Plato to modern political thought, we have wrestled with the paradox of power. The film translates that question into fists and capes, but the underlying dilemma is timeless. Then there is the theme of legacy and trauma. The mortal's entire identity is shaped by a childhood wound, a moment of violence that forever transformed his worldview. He becomes the embodiment of a trauma survivor whose life is consumed by vengeance. Every decision he makes, every enemy he sees, is filtered through the lens of that wound. The god, too, carries legacy, not a trauma but origin. His existence is a legacy of another world, another people, and he bears the crushing responsibility of living up to what they could not. Legacy here is not celebratory. It is a burden, shaping individuals into weapons of ideology. Literature has always understood this weight. Hamlet, chained to his father's ghost. Achilles, chained to his mother's prophecy. The characters here inherit legacies that they can neither escape nor fully embrace. Another powerful theme is a conflict between human and divine. On one side, a being of near limitless power who tries to be human but never can. On the other, a man who fears irrelevance in the shadow of divinity, and so transforms himself into something more than human. Their conflict is not about personal hatred, but about existence itself. What it means for gods and mortals to share the same earth. This is where symbolism shines most clearly. The mortal's armor is not just protection. It is his attempt to elevate himself into the realm of gods, a desperate clawing upward. The god's cape, by contrast, is not merely a costume but a symbol of his otherness, a banner marking him as alien, as apart. Their costumes, their weapons, their very images become metaphors for philosophical clash they embody. The role of mothers, too, emerges as one of the most unexpected but potent themes. Both the god and the mortal are shaped by their mothers, one lost in tragedy, the other still living but endangered. When the name of a mother halts a battle, critics mocked its bluntness, but in truth it is profoundly symbolic. In literature, the mother often represents the origin of empathy, the anchor of humanity. To realize that even a god clings to his mother's name collapses the divide between divine and human. In that moment, vengeance dissolves into recognition, and the theme becomes clear. What binds us is not power or ideology but love, fragile and ordinary. The monster, meanwhile, embodies a different symbolism altogether. Created through arrogance, it is a warning drawn straight from the tradition of Frankenstein. It symbolizes what happens when humanity tries to harness power without wisdom, when fear and envy drive creation. Its grotesque body mirrors the grotesque ambition that birthed it. Every strike it lands is a metaphor for hubris punishing its creator. In this way, the monster is less a villain than a symbol, reminding us of literature's eternal warning. That man, in playing God, often creates his own destruction. The warrior who arrives in the final act symbolizes something different, a bridge between past and present, myth and modernity. Her armor gleams like something from Homeric epic, her sword and shield evoking Athena herself. She carries into the modern battlefield the weight of ancient wars, reminding us that humanity has always fought its monsters, whether literal or metaphorical. Her presence is symbolic not only of female strength but of timelessness, the continuity of myth across ages. She represents wisdom stepping into chaos, a reminder that humanity's struggles are never truly new. Even the settings themselves become symbolic. The ruined city is not just rubble, but the embodiment of fear, that civilization itself cannot survive divine conflict. The empty mansion is a symbol of obsession, hollowing out a life. The farm is a symbol of fragile humanity, the ordinary existence forever lost to extraordinary beings. The courtroom symbolizes the failure of human institutions to contain godlike power. And the wasteland of dreams symbolizes the ultimate fear, that gods will not save us but enslave us. Each space is more than a backdrop. It is a metaphor in architecture. One cannot ignore the Christ imagery woven throughout. The God who sacrifices himself to save humanity, pierced as he pierces the beast, falls with arms outstretched as though on a cross. Crowds gather to mourn him, candles flicker like prayers, and the soil itself rises in promise of resurrection. This symbolism is not hidden. It is deliberate, echoing centuries of messianic narrative. Yet it is complicated by the fact that his sacrifice is not universally accepted. Unlike Christ, whose followers embrace him after death, here the world remains divided, unsure whether the Savior was truly Savior at all. The symbolism, then, is not simplistic worship, but interrogation of faith itself. The film's recurring use of light and darkness also functions symbolically. The god is often framed against the sun, his silhouette bathed in golden light. representing divinity and distance. The mortal, by contrast, emerges from shadows, his figure carved from darkness. When they collide, their settings merge, light against dark, sky against earth, hope against fear. It is visual poetry, as if the camera itself were painting a clash of archetypes. Even silence becomes symbolic. The courtroom explosion, followed by absolute quiet, symbolizes a failure of dialogue. The silent coffin at the end symbolizes not just death, but mystery, the possibility of return. In literature, silence often speaks louder than words, and here it functions as punctuation, forcing us to sit with the weight of meaning. What fascinates me most is how these themes and symbols refuse to resolve neatly. Fear is never fully conquered, trust never fully restored. The divine never becomes fully human, nor the human fully divine. Sacrifice brings hope, but not certainty. These ambiguities make the film feel less like a resolved story and more like an epic poem, leaving questions to echo long after the last page, or in this case, the last frame. This is why, to me, the film endures despite its controversies. It is not merely spectacle, it is allegory. It is myth dressed in modern costume. It wrestles with themes of fear, power, trauma, motherhood, hubris, sacrifice, and resurrection. Its symbols speak across cultures and centuries, reminding us that the struggles of gods and mortals are not confined to comic books. They are the very struggles literature has always told us we cannot escape. What has always fascinated me about this film is that its power doesn't lie only in what it says or what happens on screen, but in how it says it. Like a novel whose sentences carry rhythm and weight beyond the story itself. The filmmaking techniques here are inseparable from its meaning. Every choice of camera angle, every edit, every note of sound is designed not merely to entertain, but to create an atmosphere of myth, of heaviness, of awe. And just as the story itself divided audiences, the very techniques used to tell became points of debate, celebration, and criticism. The most striking aspect is the director's obsession with imagery. He doesn't just frame scenes, he composes them like paintings. The fall of pearls in an alley, slowed to near eternity, becomes not just a flashback, but a ritual, a sacred memory etched into visual scripture. The god hovering above floodwaters, arms outstretched, illuminated by sun-piercing clouds, looks less like a superhero shot and more like a Renaissance painting of a saint. Even destruction, rubble, smoke, fire, is rendered with operatic grandeur, as though every broken building is a stanza in a tragic poem. This painterly style, meticulous and deliberate, is what gives the film its mythic aura. Slow motion, too, is a technique used not for spectacle alone, but for reverence. When fists collide, when bullets fly, when eyes widen in horror, time stretches. It's as if the director refuses to let moments slip by unnoticed. Literature often lingers on pivotal moments, stretching description, forcing the reader to dwell. Here, slow motion is cinematic literature, an insistence that we sit with the weight of violence, with the fragility of choice. Lighting becomes another form of storytelling. Shadows dominate, swallowing characters in darkness until thin beams of light pierce through, illuminating faces like divine spotlight. The god is often bathed in golden glow, symbolic of his otherness, while mortal is cloaked in muted tones, his world built of gray and black. The warrior, when she finally steps forward, is framed in firelight, her armor glinting, her silhouette glowing with ancient radiance. These contrasts are not accidental. They are thematic. The lighting tells us, before words do, who these people are and what they symbolize. Editing, too, reflect the fractured nature of the world it depicts. Scenes often cut abruptly, shifting from grandeur to intimacy, from myth to human sorrow. Some found this jarring, but to me it feels deliberate. The world itself is fractured, half kneeling in worship, half preparing for war, and the editing mirrors that instability. Long, contemplative shots give way to sudden bursts of chaos, reminding us that trust, peace, and stability are fragile illusions. Sound plays perhaps the most visceral role. The score is thunderous, operatic, a blend of pounding drums and mournful strings. It crashes like war, but weeps like elegy. When the god soars, the music swells with near-religious awe. When destruction falls, the score groans with heavy lament. Silence, however, is used with equal power. The courtroom explosion followed by total silence is not just shocking, it is devastating. That silence is heavier than any roar sound, forcing the audience to sit in grief. Literature uses white space to similar effect. Here, silence is cinematic white space, a pause that says more than dialogue ever could. Camera movement, too, tells its own story. When humans gaze up at the god, the camera tilts skyward, capturing awe and intimidation. When the mortal stalks the knight, the camera follows low and close, as though afraid to stand too near. During battle, the camera sways, stumbles, shakes, putting us inside the chaos rather than above it. At other times, it pulls back, offering wide frames that make characters look small against towering cities or desolate wastelands. These choices remind us constantly of scale. Gods dwarf men, yet even gods are dwarfed by the weight of the world. One of the most subtle but effective techniques is repetition. The film returns again and again to images of falling. Pearls falling, towers collapsing, heroes crashing to the ground. Fallen becomes symbolic of vulnerability, of humanity's helplessness, of the fragility of gods themselves. Each repetition deepens the theme, like a refrain in poetry, reminding us that descent is as important as ascent. Even costumes and sound design intertwine with technique. The metallic clang of armor, the whisper of capes and wind, the monstrous roar of the final creature, all are crafted to feel tactile, physical, unavoidable. You don't just watch the battle, you feel it in your chest. The suit of the mortal, groaning with weight, amplifies his humanity. The quiet rustle of the god's cape amplifies his otherness. The warrior's shield crashing against the monster's flesh amplifies her defiance. Every sound is symbolic texture. But filmmaking is not just art, it is commerce. And the box office became its own chapter in this story. When the film was announced, anticipation was feverish. The first time these two titans would clash on the big screen, how could it not dominate? Opening weekend confirmed that expectation. Audiences poured into theaters, and the film earned staggering sums almost immediately. It was one of the highest-grossing debuts of its time, cementing its status as an event rather than just a release. And yet, what followed was more complicated. Box office numbers remained strong, but divisive. Critics split sharply, some praising the ambition and grandeur, others condemning the heaviness and tone. Audiences argued. 2. Some felt they had witnessed art. Others walked out unsatisfied. This division shaped the financial journey. The film ultimately earned hundreds of millions, crossing the billion mark in adjusted global revenue. But the debates around it overshadowed the numbers. It wasn't just about success or failure. It became about interpretation, about whether ambition should be punished or rewarded. The studio itself experienced this tension. On one hand, the film had laid the groundwork for an entire shared universe, proving that audiences would come. On the other, the controversies sparked nervousness. Future films were reshaped in response. Tones altered, approaches reconsidered. The box office, then, was not just financial data, it was narrative consequence. The reception influenced creative choices for years afterward, shaping not just one film, but an entire cinematic mythology. In a sense, the box office mirrored the film itself. Just as the story explored division between man and God, fear and trust, the financial aftermath revealed division among audiences. Some elevated it to cult status, others dismissed it as failure. Numbers alone cannot capture that complexity. What matters is that the box office became part of the myth, part of the ongoing debate about art, ambition, and reception. Looking at the techniques and the financial journey together, one truth emerges. This film was never meant to be safe. Its images dare to be operatic. Its sound dare to be overwhelming. Its editing dare to fracture rhythm. Its story dared to weigh heavy. And in daring so greatly, it invited division. Not everyone was willing to sit with tragedy dressed as spectacle. But that in itself is a technique. The film forces us not just to watch, but to argue, not just to consume, but to wrestle. Its very reception became part of its meaning. So when I think of the filmmaking techniques, I don't think only of how the movie looks or sounds. I think of how those choices shaped its identity, how they made it impossible to ignore, how they turned a blockbuster into a piece of cinematic literature. And when I think of the box office, I don't think only of the numbers. I think of how those numbers reflected division, how they transformed the film into myth, not just on screen, but in culture. What often happens with films of this scale is that the story doesn't end with the credits. The actors carry their roles beyond the set, into interviews, into conversations with fans, into the way their performances are remembered, and the audiences, divided and passionate, become part of the narrative themselves. With this film, that dynamic was especially vivid. The cast became almost mythic figures in their own right, and the reviews, whether filled with praise or disdain, became part of the film's identity. The Mortal Protector, played by an actor whose casting had sparked outrage at first, became a point of fascination. In interviews, he spoke of the challenge of embodying a man already weathered by years of loss. He didn't want to play the polished, idealized figure audiences had seen before. He wanted to play someone broken, someone who had stared too long into the abyss. When asked about the criticism of his darker portrayal, he was candid. He admitted it wasn't meant to please everyone, that the point was to show a different facet of a character too often simplified. What struck me most about his words was the sense of weariness, not just in the role, but in the way he carried the backlash. He had poured himself into a performance that was both brutal and vulnerable, and whether people loved or hated it, he stood by it. The God in Blue, reprised by the actor who had already introduced him in an earlier film, offered a different perspective. In interviews, he often emphasized the loneliness of the role. He described wearing the cape not as a symbol of power, but as a burden. Fans often approached him with reverence, but he admitted he played the character as someone who felt alien, someone who could never truly belong. His words revealed the subtle depth of his performance, that beneath the physical perfection and heroic deeds was a man who constantly asked himself whether he was helping or harming. It made me appreciate the quiet sadness he brought to the role, a sadness that often went unnoticed amid the spectacle. The warrior, though, brought an entirely different energy to the conversation. In press tours and interviews, she radiated enthusiasm. She spoke about the discipline of training, the thrill of wielding weapons, the pride she felt in representing strength not defined by comparison to men, but by its own standard, her laughter, her excitement. Her joy in the role seemed to leap off the screen. For many fans, her arrival was a highlight of the film, a moment where myth and modern cinema merged with fresh energy. She often said she wanted her portrayal to inspire girls to see themselves as warriors, not just side characters. And in that sense, she succeeded. Her performance became iconic almost immediately, paving the way for stories that centered her. The trickster, the puppeteer behind the chaos, had his own curious relationship with the role. In interviews, the actor leaned into the eccentricity of his character, often answering questions with the same unpredictable energy he carried on screen. Some loved this, others found it grating, but it mirrored his performance. Unsettling, unsteady, deliberately divisive. He admitted he wanted audiences to feel off balance when he appeared, to never quite know whether to laugh or recoil. It was a bold choice, and it sparked as much debate as the film itself. Even supporting cast members offered insights. The loyal butler, played with weary wit, spoke about how his character was meant to ground the story, to remind us that even amid gods and monsters, there are humans watching, judging, trying to steer. The reporter, the god's anchor to humanity, spoke of her character's courage, how she wasn't meant to be a damsel but an active seeker of truth. These smaller roles, though overshadowed by titans, gave texture to film, and the actors themselves carried that pride into every interview. But of course, no discussion is complete without the audience. The reactions were immediate and fierce. Some hailed the film as a masterpiece, a bold, operatic vision that dared to treat superheroes as myth rather than entertainment. They praised its depth, its imagery, its ambition. For them, it was not a film to be consumed once, but to be studied, rewatched, unpacked. They filled forums and video essays with analysis, treating the film like a text from literature. Others, however, rejected it just as passionately. They found it too heavy, too dark, too unwilling to offer joy. They complained about pacing, about tone, about choices that defied their expectations. For them, the film was less myth and more mess, a work trying too hard to be profound. Their reviews, often scathing, became part of the cultural conversation, shaping how the film was perceived in the mainstream. What fascinated me most was how divided households became. I remember reading accounts of friends walking out of theaters arguing, families split down the middle, one half praising, the other half condemning. The film became not just a piece of art, but a litmus test for taste. Do you prefer myth or entertainment? Do you value ambition even if flawed? Or do you demand clarity even if simple? The film forced people to choose, and in that choosing, it revealed as much about the audience as about itself. Critics, too, were split. Some hailed it as Shakespearean in its tragedy, comparing its weight to Greek epics. Others dismissed it as pretentious, accusing it of mistaking darkness for depth. The very same elements, its painterly cinematography, its solemn tone, its heavy symbolism, were celebrated by some and derided by others. Rarely does a film divide critical voices so sharply, and yet that division is part of what makes it fascinating. Over time, however, the tide began to shift. While mainstream reviews remained mixed, a passionate fan base grew louder, defending the film as misunderstood, as ahead of its time. Online campaigns, essays, retrospectives began reframing the conversation. Interviews with cast members years later often touched on this phenomenon. The way a once-reviled film had become a cult favorite, its ambition finally appreciated. The actors themselves seemed grateful, relieved even, that their work was being reassessed with kinder eyes. For me, the interplay between cast and audience is what makes this chapter so compelling. The actors pour themselves into performances meant to be layered, nuanced, difficult. The audiences responded with equal passion, whether in admiration or rejection. And in that clash between performance and reception, the film transcended its own screen. It became a cultural dialogue, a mirror reflecting not only its characters but us, our expectations, our divisions, our willingness or unwillingness to wrestle with art that dares to be heavy. By the time the dust settled, the film's reputation was not defined by numbers alone but by voices. Voices of actors defending their work, voices of fans praising or condemning, voices of critics drawing comparisons to everything from Homer to Nietzsche. And perhaps that is the most fitting outcome. A story about gods and mortals, about voices raised in worship or defiance, became itself a story about voices, audiences and actors, critics and fans, all contributing to the myth. As I sit back and think about everything we've explored together, the story, the characters, the strange facts, the themes, the craft, the reception, I realize this film is less a single narrative and more a vast mosaic. Each piece, whether loved or hated, fits into something larger. And like any great work of myth or literature, it refuses to give us easy answers. Instead, it leaves us wrestling with contradictions, unsettled but thoughtful, haunted by questions too large to be dismissed. What began in an alley with a boy and pearls was not just a retelling of trauma, but the planting of a seed that would grow into paranoia, obsession, and vengeance. What began with a god descending from the sky was not simply a savior's arrival, but the burden of a world forced to confront the meaning of divinity. When these two threads crossed, when man and God collided, the story didn't give us clarity. It gave us paradox. It gave us tragedy. It gave us the kind of ending that feels more like a question than an answer. We saw characters who were not simply roles but philosophies. The mortal embodying fear, control, the desperate will of humanity to remain sovereign. The God embodying hope, sacrifice, and the alienation that comes with carrying too much. The warrior embodying timeless wisdom, stepping in not as ally or rival, but as a reminder that humanity's struggles are eternal. The trickster embodying envy and chaos, revealing how fragile the balance is when even one man decides to pull strings. Around them swirled anchors and witnesses. The reporter, the butler, the chorus of humanity divided between worship and protest. Each of them mattered, because together they painted the portrait of a world that could not agree on what to do with power. We looked at the strangest facts behind the production, actors training until their bodies became temples of obsession, sets built and destroyed until extras coughed on dust that wasn't real but felt real, accidents turned into art, secrecy that leaked into rumor. These oddities remind us that films are not made neatly but in chaos, in improvisation, in human frailty. We studied the critical events as though they were verses from an epic poem, the courtroom silenced by fire, the battlefield raging with monster and martyr, the name of the mother halting vengeance, the soil rising with the promise of resurrection. Each of these events spoke not just to the plot, but to the themes we live with: fear, power, trust, sacrifice. We saw how production itself mirrored myth. The director painting each frame like scripture, the composers clashing until their music became a hymn of both war and lament, the actors inhabiting loneliness, paranoia, laughter. We saw how the settings, the ruined city, the empty mansion, the golden farm, the wastelands of dream, were not simply places but metaphors, architecture transformed into philosophy. We went behind the scenes, walking with the crew as they staggered under exhaustion, laughed in rare moments of levity, kept secrets as though guarding holy texts. We listened to interviews where actors defended, explained, and celebrated their choices, even as critics tore them apart. We saw audiences divide, friends argue, families split, until the film itself became less a work of cinema and more a mirror of our own inability to agree on what stories should mean. We wrestled with themes and symbols, the Christ imagery of sacrifice, the Frankensteinian warning of hubris, the archetypes of fear and hope, mother and son, light and dark. We saw how repetition, silence, color, shadow, and even costume spoke like poetry, turning spectacle into allegory. And finally, we remember that filmmaking is not just art, but commerce. We traced the box office, the roaring debut, the divided aftermath, the way numbers became narrative, shaping future films and reshaping reputations. We realized that reception is not an afterthought, but part of the myth itself. So what is the conclusion? For me, it is this. This film is literature disguised as cinema. It is not perfect, but neither is Homer's Iliad or Milton's Paradise Lost or Shakespeare's tragedies. Great works are rarely perfect. They are heavy, they're flawed, they're divisive, but they endure because they provoke, because they force us to look at ourselves differently. This story of gods and mortals, of vengeance and sacrifice, does exactly that. It unsettles us, makes us argue, makes us feel. That is art's highest purpose. And perhaps that is why I love it. Not because it gives me comfort, but because it refuses to. Not because it answers questions, but because it multiplies them. Not because it is simple, but because it is difficult. It resonates with my own experiences of doubt, of wondering whether power is gift or curse, of wondering whether trust can survive fear. It resonates because, like literature, it reminds me that we are always caught between the human and the divine, always struggling to decide whom to kneel before, whom to fight, whom to forgive. So as we close this journey, I want to thank you, my fellow literature enthusiasts, for walking through this labyrinth with me, for sitting to the weight of words, the heaviness of themes, the strange beauty of film that dare to be more than entertainment, reading together by lamplight, pause and underline passages, debating interpretations, feeling the ache of tragedy and the thrill of symbolism. If this exploration has meant something to you, if it has made you think, if it has sparked new questions, if it has reminded you that cinema can be as deep as the greatest novels, then I ask, kindly and sincerely, that you subscribe to this channel, not for numbers, not for vanity, but to grow a community where stories are treated with reverence, where films are studied as literature, where myths are unpacked together. Your presence here makes this more than a monologue. It makes a conversation, a shared ritual of curiosity. And though this chapter closes, the story doesn't end. Just as a grain of soil trembled at the coffin's edge, so too do stories rise again, waiting to be retold, re-examined, rediscovered. This one will linger in me, and I hope perhaps it lingers in you too, not as a simple movie, but as a piece of myth, a mirror held up to our fear, our hope, our endless need to understand what it means to be human in the shadow of gods. Until the next story, my friends, thank you.